This is Cat Williams in 2008 doing material about George Bush when America was ready for a change. This is Cat Williams in 2024 doing material on wokeness when America was ready for a change. Look, traditionally comedy is seen as a sort of left-wing plaything. And the thing is, comedians have a lot more in common with, writers, poets, musicians. They tend to be culturally left. But have you noticed that recently all your favorite comedians have just become right-wing or right-coded? Comedy has always been political, but in the last 10 to 20 years, this weird thing has happened where now it's become kind of cool to be right-wing. Now look, the stereotype is that right-wing comedy is awful, because it kind of is. It's horrible, actually. Any comedy that tries to have an agenda overtly is terrible. But nowadays, a lot of comedians tend to be, more pally-pally with the right, more pally-pally with right-wing presidents and political icons. And I've been doing comedy for 6 years, and even in that short time at the beginning, if you were seen as a right-wing comedian, everyone would think that would be super cringe and lame. Now look, for those of you who are going to call me a lefty soy boy, I don't really see myself on either side. I have a lot of lefty views, look, I like socialized medicine, but I think capitalism is cool. I think that Karl Marx probably had some nice things to say, but I really loved Ayn Rand. Google it. So it's not just me who doesn't like the right-wing comedy. If you type in on YouTube, right-wing comedy, the first thing you get are videos on why it's terrible. Before we go any further, I want to explain what I'm going to be talking about when I say right and left wing, because there's a couple ways to kind of think about it. The way I want to divide it is intellectually right-wing and left-wing and culturally right-wing and left-wing. I'll give you an example of what intellectually right and left is, and that's not what I'm talking about. Look, this is an example given by the God King Jordan Peterson in his heyday. Imagine you're walking through a meadow. It's really nice, it's really lovely, you're having a good time. But when you're walking through that meadow, you suddenly see a wall that has no reason to be there. The type of person who sees that wall and says, I want to tear it down and I want to make this better, I want to change things, would be someone who's progressive or left-wing. The type of person who stops and says, I wonder why this wall was here. Maybe it has some sort of societal value. Maybe this wall is helping the community, blah, blah, blah. They would be seen as conservative because they're conserving, or right-wing. I'm not talking about any of that shit. I'm not talking about the intellectual, smarty pants stuff. I'm just talking about the stuff that you can just point to and say, that's right wing, that's left wing. Look, in America, Hollywood coded as left, right? The elites, talking about diversity. And then you have guns, National Rifle Organization coded as right. You know what I mean? Like the big guys with the guns, they're right-wing meat eaters. In the UK, for example, you have on the right something like fox hunting, and on the left something like being arrested at a climate protest. So why did comedians go from being more friends with those people who are known as culturally left, like Hollywood and climate protesters, to being more friends with the people who wave around guns and like to go fox hunting? First, I want to talk about the structure of comedy, how it works, and the realm that it actually exists in. For comedy to work, it has to be in a world where you can have trial and error, make mistakes, say awful things that make no sense whatsoever. But nowadays, because we've become more open and culturally aware of minorities and their experiences, which is a good thing, as a minority myself, it has become a bit more difficult to say things that you might regret and that you don't even justify as something that's appropriate to say, because people who are more culturally on the left will come at you and say that that's something that's wrong, that's something that you shouldn't be saying, because they tend to be more open and aware of the experience of minorities. Comedy works better in an environment where you can freely mess up, which is why if you've ever gone to a comedy night and it's a new material night, they beg you not to record because they don't want any of that stuff documented. But comedy in the digital age has led to a couple of problems. Let's say 3, actually. The first one is sometimes people will say things that are awful and they are just trying to be funny and they didn't mean to hurt anyone. Usually people will apologize for this and they mean no harm. Number 2, sometimes people will use comedy as a vehicle to say genuinely awful things and they know what they're doing. Or number 3, people will write a bad joke that offends people, and instead of just acknowledging the lack of skill or the mistake they made, they'll say, oh, you're so sensitive, why are you crying so much, it's just a joke, bro. These are all pretty common things. I'm a comedian, sometimes we say things especially that we think are gonna be funny that are probably offensive and we don't mean it, and most of the time you just have to acknowledge it. But on the other side of that, audiences kind of need to accept that a lot of what's happening that comedians are doing isn't like a political speech or their genuine thoughts. It's a performance or and act. But people don't want to all the time because they either don't understand comedy or they willingly don't want to engage with it on the level that it's meant to be. And people genuinely get offended. But there is also another side where people sometimes get offended and they use that as a weapon to kind of suppress what people are saying because they don't like it. And because we're in a world where people are much more open to the experiences of minorities and people who've been essentially not in the conversation for a long time, we're now in this situation now where people who are more on the left are kind of shutting down a lot of comedians. Because being like that is kind of more coded as left wing. And whether rightly or wrongly these people are shutting down what the comedians are saying, it means eventually comedians get pushed more and more right because the right says, hey, say that racist thing to us, we'll love it, we'll pay you loads of money. The worst part about it is it takes comedians who probably actually have more in common with people who are culturally left, and it makes them more right-wing, or at least their brand more right-wing. I just want to say, like, comedy is comedy. Just because a joke offends people doesn't mean that it's a joke that shouldn't be said or it's a bad person who's even said that joke. But more and more there's this tension between what people want to say and their freedom of expression and offending people and making people feel bad. And I don't know what the right solution is. I tend to be much more let people say what they say, and if it offends people, it is what it is. We'll deal with it as a society. But in this world of all this tension, the worst thing that could have happened was COVID. Rewind to 2020. COVID-19 changed how we consumed media, how we ate, how we worked, how we played, how we loved. It was the biggest change in a very long time. It's been 5 years, and it's crazy to remember that before COVID, Bernie Sanders was on Joe Rogan and he endorsed him, Jimmy Dore was a big old lefty, and Russell Brand was a vegan, feminist, enlightened, spiritual guru. I don't know what he called himself. Here's my recounting of culturally what happened. Initially, had this world where no one had any idea what was going to happen. The UK and the US, they were both going to shut down for only 2 weeks, but the lockdowns went longer and longer. And look, I'm not here to litigate lockdowns. I'm a doctor, I'm pro-vaccine, all that stuff. But you can't deny that a lot of the messaging was pretty messed up. Messaging is different to science. The science was good, the vaccine was good, all of that stuff was good. But how people talked about it really confused a lot of people in the general public. As someone with a medical degree, there were many times when I could hear what the public health officers were saying in both countries, and I could understand why people were getting confused. So imagine a world where there's a lot of confusion and people don't understand what's happening and it's scary and it's new. And the only place where these fringe ideas are being discussed is on these podcasts. And especially when some of these fringe ideas ended up having more truth to them than we thought, like the whole lab leak thing. Regardless, the only place where these ideas, right or wrong, were ever being discussed or entertained was on these podcasts that ended up becoming more and more anti-establishment or right-wing. You also have to understand that as comedians, we have a tendency to be anti-authority. I see it in myself, class clowning. I hate being told what to do. We all do. It is how it is. So if you mix that with a current government that leans sort of left, and you have comedians who are the only vehicle to talk about things that the current government or the liberal left media won't talk about, you have this situation where these podcasts become more and more anti-establishment because that's what the audiences want, because no one else is filling that niche. So these podcasts post-COVID have become this vehicle to express ideas that the mainstream media won't do. And in this situation, anti-establishment becomes right-wing because now and in the past, the left have been in power. But look, COVID didn't just change how media was consumed or the people who made media. It also changed the people who engaged in it. Now, there's no question that men and women have become politically more distinct. Women voted more for Harris and men voted more for Donald Trump. We know this, right? Now, the reason for this will be determined by people who are much smarter than I am. But as a guy, as a man, a lot of the things that men tend to be interested in become much more right-coded. Not necessarily actually right-wing in their beliefs, but they become kind of right-wing. You know what I mean? Like video games, working out, dating, business. All these things kind of become right-wingish. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, take someone like Jocko Willink. I'm a big fan of Jocko. Does great stuff. No criticism on guy. But look at this guy. He's a business guy, gym person, former Navy SEAL. He looks like he's got his shit together. But does this guy really look like he would fit in at a lefty hippie drum circle? No, he looks right-coded. And this has nothing to do with what Jocko actually thinks or what his thoughts are actually on anything. In fact, all these things are kind of separate to what the actual person actually thinks in their political views. In fact, really, these things are just about being kind of coded a certain way instead of how the person actually thinks in their heart. And also, there's nothing wrong with being right-wing either. Like I said, I probably have some right-wing views, I don't know. But ultimately, it's not a good or a bad thing. Being right and being a man is kind of the status quo, and I think a lot of people on the left need to really accept that. But a lot of the audiences for podcasts are men, and men tend to be right-wing. So what else do you expect? Imagine if you were someone who had one of these comedy podcasts and the world and men are shifting kind of right-wing. How else would you react but tailor your content to be more and more for the audience that you serve? Also, look, the reality is comedians are kind of against the status quo at their best. And the current state of affairs makes me sad. Not because, I want all comedians to be talking about climate change or whatever, but because I think that comedy shouldn't really fit into a box. I want a good comedian who says, this bullshit tribalism, this left and right wing stuff. It's to me, that's comedy at its best, when it brings a nuanced take instead of just saying what all the other tribes are saying. But I do think it's kind of weird having a political candidate on a comedy podcast. I think we're in a completely different world where this creative medium is somehow now associated with the right for the first time, and I think that's something to be noted. Like, the reason I got into comedy was because of Dave Chappelle's Sticks and Stones. There's no question about that. But who would have thought that the guy who made Chappelle's Show, one of the best dissections of race and culture in comedy history, is now known as right-wing comedian Dave Chappelle? Ultimately, comedy will always be countercultural. It'll always be anti-establishment. That's kind of the point of comedy. Now, the thing that the 2008 clip of Cat Williams and the 2024 clip of Cat Williams have in common is they're both against the current culture. They're both anti-establishment. My concern that if we normalize a world where you can have politicians on your comedy podcasts and you buddy with the president and the vice president, then what makes you different from Seth Meyers or Stephen Colbert, who are basically the propaganda arm of the Democratic Party? Now, all the comedians I've talked about, they may not be right-wing in their hearts. They may not even be political at all, but their brand and the way that the world perceives them has pushed them to being culturally right. But the whole world is having a bit of a right-wing moment. So, maybe that's just a sensible decision to go where your audience is shifting. Like, it's only been 6 months since the UK election. People are already gagging for Labour to step down. So in 4 years' time, maybe we'll cycle through again and it'll be cool to be left-wing. But look, I wish we could just step away from all the bullshit and just realize, like Chris Rock said, that it's just all a bunch of gangs anyway, whichever way you go. Peace.
The whole country's got a fucked up mentality, man. We all got a gang mentality. Republicans are fucking idiots, and Democrats are fucking idiots, and conservatives are idiots, and liberals are idiots, and anyone that makes up their mind before they hit an issue is a fucking fool, okay?